The communiqué was finalized in the dead of night, but its seismic rupture was felt at dawn. In an unprecedented move that realigns the post-war global order, the group of 7 nations have formally suspended the United States from its membership, effectively expelling the world's largest economy from its own diplomatic creation. The decision, conveyed through a terse 3-paragraph statement from the current G7 presidency, cites irreconcilable differences on fundamental principles of multilateral cooperation and collective security. This is not a temporary boycott or a diplomatic snub. It is a surgical excision. For the first time since the forum's inception as the G6 in 1975, the chair at the table reserved for the United States will remain empty, a silent testament to a collapse that was decades in the making but crystallized in a single stark vote. Inside sources across multiple capitals describe the final 48 hours as a maelstrom of encrypted calls and emergency summits, a coordinated diplomatic maneuver of breathtaking audacity. The trigger, officials confirm, was not a singular policy, but a final perceived point of no return. The Trump administration's confirmed intent to unilaterally withdraw from the NATO treaty, coupled with an executive order imposing comprehensive tariffs on all G7 partner nations. The message from Washington was no longer one of disagreement, but of active hostility. A senior European diplomat involved in the negotiations stated, speaking on strict condition of anonymity, the calculus shifted from managing a difficult partner to protecting the institution itself. The body was rejecting the organ. The move, while stunning, reflects a cold new reality where traditional alliances are being sacrificed in the name of national sovereignty as defined by one nation. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must revisit the genesis of the forum itself. The G7 was born from the ashes of the 1973 oil crisis, a gathering of the world's major advanced economies, the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Canada, to coordinate macroeconomic policy in a spirit of liberal internationalism. It was, in essence, a steering committee for the Western-led order, with the United States as its undisputed anchor and guarantor. For nearly 50 years, through Cold War conclusion and financial crises, the annual summit served as a ritual reaffirmation of shared democratic and economic values. The group expanded briefly to the G8 with Russia's inclusion, only to contract again after the annexation of Crimea, demonstrating its capacity for enforcement of geopolitical red lines. Yet the prospect of the architect leaving the building was considered inconceivable. The roots of today's fracture, analysts universally agree, predate the current administration but were dramatically accelerated by it. The America First doctrine, articulated from the campaign trail onward, represented a fundamental philosophical rejection of the multilateral framework the G7 embodies. Early confrontations at summits over climate change, trade deficits, and burden sharing were often papered over by vague language in final communiques. However, the underlying tension was structural. The United States, under this paradigm, began to view the group not as a coalition of partners, but as a consortium of competitors, a zero-sum arena where historical ties held negligible weight against immediate transactional gains. This persistent worldview steadily eroded the reservoir of trust built over generations. Previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, had moments of friction with allies. The Iraq War in 2003 caused profound rifts, particularly with France and Germany. However, those disputes operated within a recognized framework of ultimate solidarity. They were family arguments. The schism that opened after 2016 was of a different character, described by one former British ambassador to the U.S. as existential and epistemological. It questioned the very value of alliances, intelligence sharing, and open markets. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal were early warning signals. The imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and the European Union under national security pretexts was a shock that never fully receded, revealing a willingness to weaponize interdependence against the nation's closest friends. The personal dynamics at summits became a metaphor for the dysfunction. Photographs from recent gatherings showed a visibly isolated American president, his body language closed off during working sessions, while other leaders huddled in easy consultation. The traditional family photo became an exercise in strained optics, studied by diplomatic body language experts as a gauge of cohesion. Leaked accounts of closed-door sessions described circular debates with 6 nations attempting to persuade a 7th on basic facts of collective security or economic data to no avail. The frustration, according to insiders, metastasized from acute annoyance to a profound operational fatigue. The machinery of international coordination was grinding to a halt. For America's partners, the Ukraine conflict served as a critical stress test. While the United States did provide substantial military aid, its political messaging was often contradictory, with repeated suggestions of a negotiated settlement that would cede Ukrainian territory. More critically, the rhetoric framing NATO as an obsolete burden that encouraged free riding continued unabated. This created paralyzing uncertainty in European capitals. Could the security guarantee, the cornerstone of transatlantic peace for 75 years, be relied upon for the next 5? Simultaneously, in the Indo-Pacific, Asian allies watched with alarm as traditional U.S. steadfastness was questioned, creating openings for adversarial influence. The G7 in this context was becoming an unreliable platform for strategic unity. The narrative within the United States, of course, diverged sharply. Proponents of the administration's approach argued that the G7 had long been a forum for other nations to lobby for American concessions while contributing less. They pointed to long-standing trade imbalances and insufficient defense spending by European allies as evidence of a broken exploitative system. The unilateral actions on tariffs and NATO were framed not as destructiveness, but as necessary shocks to force a renegotiation of terms. The globalist project had failed the American worker, a former senior White House advisor asserted in a recent interview. The G7 was a symbol of that failure. Our participation was not a right. It was a privilege for them that required their fair share. This ideological chasm made mutual comprehension impossible. Canada's role in this drama is particularly poignant. As America's largest trading partner and NATO ally, with a deeply integrated economy and culture, Ottawa was often the last to give up on bridge building. Prime ministers, both Liberal and Conservative, invested extraordinary personal capital in maintaining a functional relationship. However, the imposition of tariffs under Section 232, labeled a national security threat, was experienced in Canada as a profound betrayal. It demonstrated that no historical relationship was sacred. This personal and national insult, multiple sources indicate, was pivotal in shifting the Canadian position from one of patient mediation to one of quietly supporting the most drastic corrective action available. Thus, the stage was set for the final act. The administration's notification to Congress regarding NATO withdrawal procedures, obtained by several news organizations, acted as a concrete catalyst. It transformed anxiety into imminent crisis. Diplomatic sources say the initial consultation was between France, Germany, and Japan, a powerful triad spanning the key geopolitical theaters of Europe and Asia. The discussion was not about issuing a condemnation, but about invoking the group's own foundational principles to ensure its survival. The legal and procedural groundwork examining the original Rambouillet Agreement was laid with utmost secrecy. When the UK, Italy, and Canada were brought into the fold, the consensus formed with surprising speed. The unthinkable had become the only viable option. The procedural mechanics of the expulsion were as coldly clinical as the decision itself. There is no formal expulsion clause in the G7's informal charter. Instead, the move was effected through a unanimous vote by the 6 other members to suspend all proceedings and institutions of the group indefinitely, while simultaneously announcing the immediate formation of a G6 coordination framework. This legalistic sidestep achieves the same result. The United States is out, and a new successor body, initially comprising the same 6 nations, is in. The American delegation, which had been preparing briefing books for the upcoming summit in Italy, was informed via a simultaneous démarche from the 6 host embassies in Washington, a deliberately coordinated insult underscoring the collective nature of the rebuke. Reaction from Washington was volcanic in its denunciation, but notably fractured in substance. The president condemned the move as an act of jealous treachery by failed nation-states, vowing severe economic retaliation. Congressional leaders, however, erupted in bipartisan fury for starkly different reasons. Senior Republicans aligned with the administration blamed globalist elites, while Democrats and traditional internationalist Republicans expressed horror at what they termed a self-inflicted disaster of historic proportions. The scene on Capitol Hill was one of chaos, with emergency hearings called and former secretaries of state from both parties issuing grave warnings. America's political system, already deeply polarized, now faced a foreign policy abyss with no clear path forward. The immediate international fallout extends far beyond the conference rooms of the G6. In Beijing and Moscow, officials are carefully calibrating their responses. Initial statements have been muted, almost studiously so, suggesting an assessment period is underway. Analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies note that for these powers, the disintegration of the G7 is a strategic windfall beyond their most optimistic propaganda. It creates a vacuum of Western leadership and validates their long-standing critiques of democratic dysfunction. However, there's also caution. A cornered and unpredictable United States, untethered from its alliances, poses a different and perhaps more volatile risk. The moment demands careful exploitation, not triumphalism. Within the new G6, the atmosphere is one of grim resolve mixed with profound anxiety. Publicly, leaders have framed the decision as a painful but necessary defense of the principles of democracy, rule-based trade, and collective defense. Privately, according to officials, the overwhelming emotion is one of vulnerability. The United States was not just a member, it was the security and economic linchpin. We have removed the central pillar from our own architecture, confessed a French finance ministry official. Now we must see if the structure can hold or if we have merely accelerated its collapse. Emergency talks are focused on contingency planning for currency volatility, supply chain disruptions, and enhanced mutual security assurances outside the NATO framework. The economic consequences are already flickering across global markets. The dollar initially surged in a flight to quality, but then plunged as investors digested the long-term implications of American isolation. Treasury yields are exhibiting wild swings. More structurally, the threat of across-the-board tariffs from the U.S. and reciprocal measures from the G6 promises a shock to global trade volumes not seen since the 1930s. Supply chains, already reconfigured after recent crises, now face a new political fault line. Multinational corporations with deep investments on both sides of the Atlantic are in emergency sessions, modeling scenarios that range from severe contraction to a full-scale decoupling of Western economies. The security implications are even more dire. NATO, already reeling from the pending U.S. withdrawal, now faces the prospect of its most powerful member being officially ostracized by its key European partners. This creates an absurd and dangerous paradox. The United States is still treaty-bound to defend nations that have just expelled it from their premier political club. The potential for fatal confusion in a crisis is immense. Military planners in Brussels and at the Pentagon are reportedly working in a state of near disbelief, trying to reconcile legal obligations with political hostility. The credibility of Article 5, the alliance's mutual defense clause, now hangs by the thinnest of threads, dependent on the whims of a single leader in a crisis. Expert analysis underscores the historical gravity. Historians are comparing the event not to mere diplomatic spats, but to the dissolution of the concert of Europe in the 19th century or the failure of the League of Nations in the 20th. This is not a breakdown in communication, argues Dr. Evelyn Schmidt, a professor of geopolitics at the University of Chicago. It is the failure of a shared narrative. The West, as a coherent political project with the United States at its helm, is over. What we are witnessing is the administrative paperwork of its dissolution. Other analysts are more cautious, suggesting the G6 move is a desperate bid to create a holding pattern, preserving a core group in hope of a future American return under different leadership. Insiders from the intelligence community reveal a landscape of profound professional dismay. The Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance, which includes the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is now under severe strain, with the non-American members also part of the G6 action. The flow of vital signal and human intelligence, the bedrock of Western security for decades, is already being filtered and compartmentalized. Trust is the only currency we have, and it has been abruptly devalued, said a retired senior CIA officer with long liaison experience. When your closest partners no longer trust you with their secrets and you no longer trust their motivations, you are operating in the dark. Our collective security has been irrevocably diminished. The Global South is watching with a mix of alarm and opportunity. Nations from India to Brazil to South Africa, long critical of what they saw as a Western-dominated club, now see a fragmented landscape where middle powers can wield greater influence. However, the instability is also deeply threatening. A bipolar or multipolar world has certain logic, said an African Union diplomat. A world where the traditional guarantor of last resort voluntarily abdicates is simply anarchic. It invites conflict by miscalculation. There is a rush to strengthen regional blocs and non-Western partnerships, a hedging strategy against a coming period of profound unpredictability where old rules no longer apply. The legal and institutional reverberations will take years to fully unpack. Thousands of treaties, working groups, and regulatory alignments that were facilitated through the G7 process are now in legal limbo. Everything from banking protocols and cybersecurity initiatives to public health collaboration and scientific research partnerships assumed a framework of transatlantic cooperation that has now been severed. Bureaucrats and ministries across the developed world are tasked with the colossal undertaking of disentangling cooperative mechanisms without causing immediate systemic failure. It is a silent, grinding crisis unfolding in filing cabinets and server farms with consequences that will ripple into everyday life for citizens. Domestically, within the United States, the event is acting as a powerful accelerant on existing political fractures. The upcoming presidential election is now a stark referendum on the nation's role in the world. One path offers a potential, though arduous, road to reconciliation, requiring abject diplomatic humility and likely significant policy reversals. The other path embraces the expulsion as a liberation, pushing for further disengagement and the construction of a purely transactional bilateral world order. The American electorate is being asked to choose not just between two candidates, but between two fundamentally different visions of national identity, a return to post-war leadership or an embrace of sovereign isolation. Future scenarios drafted by leading think tanks range from the grim to the catastrophic. In the most optimistic reconciliation scenario, the G6 holds firm as a cohesive bloc, containing the damage and providing a platform for a future U.S. administration to re-engage, albeit from a position of significantly diminished authority. A more likely competitive fragmentation scenario sees the G6 struggling with internal divisions without American leadership, while the U.S. pursues aggressive bilateral deals, creating a world of competing economic and security blocs. A new Cold War, but with multiple poles and less ideological clarity. This scenario breeds constant low-grade conflict and economic warfare. The worst case, but plausible, systemic collapse scenario involves a rapid escalation of tit-for-tat tariffs leading to a full-blown global trade war, triggering a deep worldwide recession. In this climate of economic despair and strategic confusion, a flashpoint in the South China Sea, the Baltic states, or the Korean Peninsula spirals out of control because the mechanisms for crisis management and de-escalation have been deliberately dismantled. In this dark projection, the expulsion of the United States from the G7 is remembered not as a cause, but as the clearest symptom of a descent into a new era of great power conflict, one enabled by the voluntary retreat of the very order designed to prevent it. The immediate task for the G6 is one of credible endurance. They must demonstrate that their new framework can deliver tangible economic and security benefits for their citizens, proving that the group is more than a reactionary club. This will require unprecedented levels of integration and compromise, particularly between Europe and Japan, on issues from defense spending to regulatory standards. Early discussions are reportedly focusing on a joint investment fund to counter coercive economic practices and a rapid reaction military force that operates under a European command, but with Japanese logistical support. These are revolutionary steps born of necessity. For the United States, the path is one of introspection under immense pressure. The international reaction has delivered the clearest possible verdict on the America First experiment from its closest peers. Whether this serves as a corrective shock or a rallying cry for further defiance is the central question of American politics. The business community, a traditional bastion of Republican support, is now facing existential threats to its global operations and is applying intense pressure. The coming months will see a brutal contest for the soul of the nation's foreign policy, played out in congressional hearings, boardrooms, and on the campaign trail. Beyond the geopolitics, there is a profound human and cultural dimension to this schism. The transatlantic community was not merely an alliance of states, it was a community of shared values, academic exchange, and intertwined histories. The decision by the G6 is, at its heart, a statement that those values have been fundamentally compromised by the American political direction. This cultural and intellectual divorce may prove even more enduring than the political one. Student exchanges, scientific cooperation, and civil society partnerships are already freezing as the assumption of shared objectives evaporates. A generation of future leaders on both sides of the Atlantic will be shaped by this estrangement. As the initial shockwaves begin to settle into a new, uneasy reality, the world map is being redrawn in real time. The expulsion of the United States from the G7 is not an endpoint, but a violent genesis. It marks the definitive end of the post-Cold War unipolar moment and the chaotic, contested birth of whatever comes next. There is no roadmap for this terrain. Every actor, from the largest nation-state to the smallest corporation, is now recalculating its interests and alliances in a landscape where the oldest certainties have vanished overnight. The stability once taken for granted is now a relic of a bygone era. In the final analysis, this event will be recorded by history as a collective failure of statecraft, a tragedy of miscalculation and hubris on all sides. The G6 nations, in their drastic action, have gambled the stability of the international system to preserve its principles. The United States, in provoking the action, has achieved a sovereign isolation its proponents sought but may not fully comprehend. The world now watches, holding its breath, as the architects of the old order dismantle their own creation, beam by beam, with no blueprint for what, if anything, will be built in its place. The chair sits empty, a simple piece of furniture that has become the most powerful symbol of a fractured age.